so that it kind of begins with a discussion of some of the things we did earlier in the semester, particularly when we had Professor Solo from MIT. So, without further ado, let's take a look. If you were to ask the question, what is responsible for the economic success of U.S. cities, you'd see they have a lot to do with the same thing that is responsible for the economic success of a business, or a national economy, or a global economy. They're the kinds of things that would go into a basic growth model pioneered by people like Professor Solo. Key factors include physical capital. You need machinery, you need tools. Number two is technology. You need to infuse those tools with a technology which improves their productivity over time. Besides physical capital, machines, factories, you need people. People with skills, human capital. So if you think about it, output, or growth in output, is equal to the growth in some function of the growth in physical output, physical capital, as it is augmented by new technology, and human capital. And we might also add natural resources. And in fact, in the very early models of growth, models put together by economists, their very simple model was growth is a function of physical capital, human capital, and natural resources, and physical capital and human capital can both be augmented either through technological increase or improvement in terms of physical capital, or such things as education and the infusion of skills into human capital. And then a lot of growth theory was really looking at how we could parse out how much of the growth over a certain period of time was due to an increment in physical capital, how much was due to an increment in human capital, how much was due to the improvement in technology, and how much was due to the improvement in skills. But there are other factors too, besides just those, and they have to do with a particular kind of technology, transportation and communications. Because what transportation and communication allow you to do, particularly as you have improvements, and from an economics point of view, that means reducing the cost of transportation and making it easier to communicate so that you can have things occurring at far-flung distances apart and yet still be able to coordinate those things. That if we have those kinds of transportation improvements and communication improvements, we can take advantage of various kinds of labor in various places, various kinds of capital, various kinds of natural resources. And then, of course, all that ties in with our discussion of globalization. Well, Professor Solo actually began to talk a little bit about two forms of growth theory. The standard neoclassical growth theory, and then something called the new growth theory, and we're going to get into that. But before we get into that, I want to introduce a series of cities that I have followed in a book that I wrote, or completed last year with two colleagues, Mary Huff Stevenson of UMass Boston and Russ Williams of Wheaton College, which dealt with a textbook which dealt with the urban experience. And in it, we follow 20 metro areas across the country. And I want to take a look at those now because they'll give you an idea of kind of the raw data that you would want to take into consideration when you think about economic growth of cities, when you think about growth models. So, here are the cities we look at. You'll see they're across the country. We wanted a nice geographical spread. They include some cities in the Northeast like Boston and Hartford, then Buffalo, New York City, down in the South, Raleigh, Atlanta, Jacksonville, in the Midwest, Detroit, Milwaukee, and Chicago and St. Louis, down in the Southwest, Austin, Phoenix, and Tucson, and then a bunch of cities on the West Coast, from Tacoma and Portland in the north, down to San Francisco and Los Angeles, the two largest cities in California. So we follow them, in fact, throughout much of this 600-page book. We're taking a look at what happened to those cities. So let's take a look at them back in 1969. I shouldn't say cities, I should say metro areas. So, for example, here we refer to the Boston, Quincy, New Hampshire metro area, which goes all the way from southern New Hampshire down to almost the Plymouth County line. So it's a big area with about 3 million people here. Or we talk about the Detroit metropolitan area, which is not just the central city of Detroit, which goes all the way up to the famous 8 Mile of M&M, but includes a lot of the suburbs. In 1969, and I think you've heard me say this, and we're doing this all in 2005 dollars to keep, take into account inflation. Of those 20 cities, Detroit actually had the highest median household income in 1969, at about $55,000. Other cities that were right at the top were Hartford, Connecticut, Chicago, and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. This is not the Stone Age, this is 1969. Buffalo is somewhere in the middle along with San Francisco. And at the bottom were these poor metro areas like Austin, Texas, Raleigh, North Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. Again, 1969. If you look at them, you'll see here, as I said, that the top 5 in order of prosperity as measured by median household income were Detroit, Hartford, Chicago, Milwaukee, and New York. And if you looked at the least prosperous in order of from least to less least, Austin, Raleigh, Durham, Jacksonville, Tucson, and Phoenix. Cities who, were just so utterly impoverished back in 1969 compared with cities like Detroit. Between 1969 and 2005, however, things changed dramatically. Austin leads these 20 cities, 20 metro areas, and we see its real median household income in 2005 dollars rise by 84%. Raleigh, North Carolina, by 57%. San Francisco, by 40%. And all the way at the bottom, you find that Milwaukee, Wisconsin, which had been one of the 4 wealthiest cities, sees its median household income decline by 7%, as does Detroit, and Buffalo is at the very bottom, losing 10% of its median household income. In other words,